نقرأ الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين شفيع ذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين وأصحابه المنتجبين، ولعنة الله الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمسابنا بأبي عبد الله الحسين عليه الصلاة والسلام. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. The topic that we have chosen for the next few days of the days of Muharram is the rational foundations or basis of Islam and the need to go back to the basics. And prior to commencing with this topic and introducing the topic, I would like to thank you for inviting me and giving this opportunity to participate in the commemoration of our beloved Imam Hussain Salamullah alayhi, who is our lifeline and for whose sake we are guided aright, and to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for keeping us alive to witness this day and for giving this opportunity and for never depriving us from the love of the Prophet and his beloved family. Now, these talks of sort are following on from talks that were delivered a couple of years ago in Birmingham. Although they were quite general, this will focus in on the nature of Islam as understood and practiced by us at present. Now, I must warn you, I do have a habit of boring people to sleep, so stay awake and look engaged, and once in a while give a nod instead of shutting your eyes. What that will do is, it will ensure I come off on time. Otherwise, I do have the habit of waffling on and losing all sense of time. So it's in our best interest that we stay awake and we stay engaged. The topic might be a little demanding at times, but I want to take it very slowly, very calmly, and explain things properly. And after each session, there will be a Q&A, or for us to openly share our thoughts. Now, what do we mean in terms of this designation and the title of the talks, the rational basis of Islam and the need to go back to basics? When we say rational basis of Islam, what we mean by the word rational here is either common sense or that which is intuitively based. And we will explain this as we go along. What does common sense mean, for example? A religion that makes sense to a reasonable person. A religion in its teachings appears to be reasonable. Do not steal, speak the truth, be a righteous person, lead a meaningful life, others enjoin good to them, share with them. These are all things that make a lot of sense. They are reasonable things. They are things to which the common sense can take to very, very easily. Live in a communal life in which you have responsibilities, you share with each other, things that are productive, that are value-based, that see that we understand as adding value to our own existence. This is what we mean by rational at one level. And at another level, what we mean by rational is what is intuitive. Do not kill people. there shouldn't be any coercion or force. Others also attain salvation. People receive good for the good that they do, so on and so forth. So these are the rational bases. What do we mean by need to revert back to the basics? Back to the basics, what it means is that if there's anything in religion that we shy away from, or we feel ashamed of, or something that we can't explain, to say that these are not parts of religion at all. And if ever they have been parts of religion, then we should make sense of them. That why were such things parts of religion? And should they be a part of religion at this point in time? Religion as we have today is not merely what the Prophet gave us, not what Quran has per se, but it's a compilation of responses to historical challenges. And when we look into it very, very closely, we find that those challenges have gone, but the responses have remained as a part of religion. And they do not make much sense. So when we say back to basic, it means to become very critical, very open-minded in our understanding of religion, and not to shy away. It stands to reason to say that anything from which we need to shy away, or we need to hide, or which we need to explain arduously cannot be a part of religion. For when the Prophet came to the people with his religion, it appealed to them. They did not frown upon anything he said. It made perfect sense to them. It was based on common sense. It was based intuitively, which we want to explain in a little while, just shed some light, and as we go along, we will talk about it more thoroughly if we can manage. But when the Prophet came to the people, they understood his religion. They took to it. He did not have to go out of his way to try and explain the truth of the religion, and people said, look, O Prophet, O Muhammad, this doesn't make sense. So back to basic means to actually examine religion very, very critically. The religion at present, is it a religion that we need to hide away from? Or a religion that people frown upon? Or a religion that can't be explained? And maybe we want to give certain examples. That there are certain things within the Quran, let us say, pick the most obvious parts of the Quran. You see, if the Quran were to have ordained people to kill each other, bloodshed and war, people would say, well, what sort of religion is this? It doesn't make sense. Now today, certain verses in the Quran are of that nature. It talks about killing. It talks about draconian forms of punishments. But when we look at them, we'll say, well, that doesn't make sense. It surely doesn't make sense. And the extremist factions within Islam uphold these verses and justify their extremist tendencies. But tell me, if religion at the outset was an extreme religion, why would people have followed it in the first instance? Shouldn't the people have said, well, O Prophet, this is no different to our Arabian war cultures. There is nothing different between what you're offering and what we are doing. But they didn't say that. So obviously it meant something very different to them, but today to us it doesn't make sense. And as a result, we hide away from it. We are embarrassed of it. We are ashamed of it. We can't explain it away. To be very open and to say, this doesn't make sense. How would it make sense? Is there a historical context there? Or after the Prophet, many things that have crept into the religion, do they make sense now? Did they only make sense at the time when they were seen as responses to the challenges faced by those people? This is something we need to understand. So I'll give an example. In maybe Surah Nisa or Ma'idah, Allah says, well, what is the recompense of those who are enemies of God, save that their hands and feet should be cut off, or that they should be banished? Now this is a very harsh verse. Very, very harsh verse. Now here, when we look into the context of this verse, we find that certain people had converted to Islam, then they ambushed Muslims, and they cut their hands and feet off, and they burnt their bodies. And in response to that incident, this verse was revealed. So now, when we look at it in that context, it makes perfect sense. We don't need to shy away. Otherwise, if we don't make sense of it, what do? We say, well, it's the Word of God. And if it's the Word of God, it has to make sense. And if it has to make sense, then it has to make sense in one way or another. But it doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to us. So what do we do with this verse now? So either we go around explaining it when it doesn't make sense, or we find that tension within ourselves, and then when the wider world reads such verses, they frown upon it. What I'm saying is that in the very beginning, they are not a part of Islam. They have a context, and in that context, it makes perfect sense. And once that context is removed, that particular response in itself is removed. If we don't have that context, then that response is invalid, because that response requires that context to exist. All the verses in which the Muslims are ordained to fight the Meccans, so on and so forth, you will only find a couple of verses in the Quran that talk about initiating war. Otherwise, by and large, the verses are about defense. Now, if you look at those verses that talk about initiating war, in today's sense, people will say, well, what sort of a barbaric religion is this? It doesn't make sense. The people are told to fight. But if we look at the context of those verses, we will see that those verses are for the situation of the Madanian community and the Meccan community, who are always at war. And it was in that context, and again, they're not talking about initiating warfare, but they're talking about this continuous system of war that needed to be settled in order to achieve everlasting peace. So we will see, we don't have to shy away from it, because that situation is not there. And they were historical responses to historical situations. And if situations were to arise again, then the nation states of the present world do the same thing, don't they? If two countries are at war constantly, then they would respond in the same manner. So what this particular thing, back to basic, means is that anything that is seen as unreasonable, or anything that we have to shy away from, or we have to hide away, whether it is within the Quran or the lifetime of the Prophet, or subsequent to that, in terms of our theology or our practices, then that has to be critically assessed. And that cannot truly be a part of religion, as religion, either it is confined in its historical context, or it is not a part of religion flatly. Let's give an example. The law of killing the apostate. We will not find it in the Quran anywhere. Now that, and if the Quran has spoken about it, it's spoken about it in a very different sense. But it's become a part and parcel of the Muslim law. Now, there was a person in Afghanistan who converted to Christianity. The Muslim world was up in arms to go and kill that person, to put him to death. Now, me and you, if we were to step away from our Islam for a moment, we will say, this particular law does not make sense, it's inhumane, it's inaccurate, it's ungodly. But within the folds of Islam, we don't have the audacity to say that. And what we find is that we have to struggle to explain it away. And then when we are in a Western modern context, we hide it away or give it such convoluted explanations that nothing makes sense anymore at all. And the fact is that it's a given law within the Muslim system. On the one hand, the Quran says, La ikraha fid din. There is no coercion in religion. On the other hand, we have a law like that, which doesn't make sense and flies in the face of such a universal human principle of lack of coercion. So what do? We become very critical. We become extremely open and say, well, what is the nature of such a law? Is there such a law? And even if there is it a historical response to a historical situation? Is it at all valid? Does it have universality? We will find it is not valid as a universal principle. It is only there for a particular situation, and it was a historical response. Even if the Quran alludes to it, it does so in a very limited context, and it can never make it at the level of a law. Let us just explain that and shed some light upon it. You see, in Taliban Islam, I would commend a person to become a Christian, because Taliban Islam is nothing to do with godliness. It is something that is inconsistent with human ethos. In fact, a person moving away from Islam, that sort of Islam, and becoming a Christian, which is far more merciful, tolerant, appreciative of differences and of the other, and if a person is genuinely trying to find God, under such circumstances and becomes a Christian, he has become a greater Muslim than what he was previously. He is not an apostate, and he's not supposed to be killed. In fact, he's supposed to be praised. We had this situation in the UK where our own congregation started calling me and they said, look, there is this Pakistani person who became a Christian, then became a priest, and now he's converting Muslims into Christians, and he's threatening that he will go into Bradford. It's a very, it's an area in which there is the dominance of the subcontinent community. He's threatening to go into Bradford and convert our boys and girls into Christianity. I said we should support him wholeheartedly. Let him make them into Christians and better human beings, for they will come closer to Islam than they are right now, because this convoluted Islam of theirs is leading them away from righteousness and from humanity. Now there, were they apostates, the people who turned, and should they be put to death? It doesn't agree with common sense. When we go back to basics, we then examine these laws. We examine these cultures, we examine these values. There's so many cultures today in religion. Do they really make sense? This hierarchy of a Sayyid and a non-Sayyid, does it really make sense? I mean, people who come to Islam from Hinduism, they come to Islam because they flee from caste systems, because there's a lot of injustice. How can Islam take them away from a system and impose a similar system upon them? How can you have economical distinctions within Islam when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, إِنَّمَا أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ, the best among you in the sight of God is the most God-conscious of you. And on the other hand, we set up a hierarchy of who is the most best one and who is less than the best. By the basics means this. Does it really make sense, all these things that were happening in Islam at present in the given religion? Do we not have the right to actually be critical and to be very open about it and to question these things? Now, I don't want to take too long in introducing the subject, so I need to move on. Now, what did the Prophet do? How did the Prophet challenge his own existing systems in the people that he found himself? And this is exactly the method we are going to take. What he did was, and the Quran says this, he challenged their minds. He said, think, does this make sense in itself? First and foremost, is it reasonable? Two, is it something that you need to hide away from? Something that you need to shy away from? Something that you can't explain away? If it is something you can't explain away, then admit that there's something wrong with it. In Yasin, we just said, وَلَقَدْ ضَلَّ مِنْكُمْ جِبِلًا كَثِيرًا أَفَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ. Do they not think? Allah is saying this in the Quran. Do they not think? Look at the Quran. It is such a challenging book. It says, if it is from other than God, it's fine. You can presume that. But then in return, I'm posing an open challenge to you. Find something which is more consistent than the Quran, which is greater in its guidance than the Quran. And bring whoever you want. Look at how challenging the Quran is. It opens the minds for the people who reflect, for the people who contemplate, for the people who think. And Allah frowns upon those people who follow practices blindly, doesn't He? Like this, we have found our fathers and forefathers. Allah says, well, what if they were misguided? In the covenant, the eternal covenant that we've made with God, what does God say? He says, least on the day of judgment you say to me, we had no knowledge of this, O Lord, or that you say to me that our forefathers did this and we were merely following in their footsteps. Why then do you chastise us for what they did? God frowns upon this. He challenges the minds to think. He says, does any of this make sense to you? And then when people respond, oh Lord, our chiefs and our elders did this and we found them doing this, what does God say? He said, well, now suffer their fate. You can't shift the blame onto anybody else. You are the stakeholder of your own life. This is your life at stake. It is something very, very precious, the Quran says. There is nobody else with you. In fact, The God, in fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at one point removes all the prophets as well from human destiny. He says, look, it'll be you yourself in front of me. And no excuse will work at that point. You know, I'll just recount an incident in the life of the Prophet. That Prophet sent an emissary at some place. And that man commanded that village to dig a trench. They dug a trench. And then he said, now fill it with firewood. They did so. He said, now kindle it. They lit it. He said, now go and fall into it. Now here the people were perplexed. They said, well, he is the representative and the ambassador of the Prophet, so we should fall into it. And others said, well, how can we do that? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, and how can we explain it? So in any case, the people who said it doesn't make sense were able to deter the people who were resolved on falling into that fire. The news reached the Prophet, and the Prophet responded. He said, had anybody thrown themselves into that fire, God would have raised them in the eternal fire on the day of Qiyamah. For indeed, there is no obedience to creatures in disobeying God. What he meant was, this doesn't make sense, and God can never say something that doesn't make sense. Now here, what happens is that the challenge that the Prophet posed to the Quran, to the disbelievers, was easy. But the challenge that was placed to the Jews and the Christians became more difficult. Why? And this is what we need to work through. You see, the disbelievers, they did not have any acquaintance with the God of Abraham, or they had forgotten. They did not have any understanding of the moral values, the theology that Islam was presenting. So for them, it was a clear-cut case. Yes, this doesn't make sense. So for example, the Prophet was giving a sermon at the door of the Kaaba, and somebody was circling the Kaaba, circumambulating, and he had put cotton inside his ears because he was warned that this Muhammad is a sorcerer. His words bewitch, so don't listen to him. He was overcome by curiosity. He took out the cotton and he began to listen. The Prophet was reciting the verses, do not kill your children through fear of poverty. We sustain them as we sustain you. The Prophet recited the verse of Surah Hud, when you transact with people, give them proper measures as you take proper measure. The person said, I immediately recognized that this man is talking about those eternal truths that are with me, and he is pointing out social evils that have crippled the society. And immediately he embraced the religion of the Prophet. But the Prophet preached the same message to the Jews and the Christians, but they were not moved. Especially the Jews, they were not moved. Why? Why were the pagans so easily convinced by the Prophet? And why were the Jews not convinced by the Prophet? Because they already had encountered the same theology, they had interpreted it, and they had perversed it. And because of their perversions, the simplicity of faith, that which was common sense, that which was intuitively available, did not make sense to them because they had clouded their own judgments. The Quran points at this. It says, look, this is what the Jews are saying, that the pagans have no rights upon us. We can do whatever we want to them. We have sacredness, they can't reach us, but they have no human sanctity. We can do whatever we want to them. Now when the verses came that no, the best among you are those who are more God-fearing of you, it made sense to the pagans totally. They said, yes, it's a fair ground. But to the Jewish community, it didn't make sense because they already said that we are the chosen ones of God and we can do anything we want and nothing will happen to us. Verse after verse after verse challenges the Jews and the Christians. Are you saying you're the chosen ones of God? In that case, why does God punish you? Awaken. Indeed, he who does evil, whoever they are, will suffer evil. Indeed, those who do good, whoever they are, will have a good consequence. But the Jewish community could not make sense because of their convoluted thinking within religion. This is the same problem with the Muslims. If we were to explain the basics of religion to a non-Muslim, they would adhere to it immediately because it would make sense to them. But if we were to explain it to the Muslim, it won't make sense. Why? Years of cultures, years of conditioning, years of convoluted thinking.
years of historical challenges that have compiled in the name of religion that we are taking today as a packaged religion without critically analyzing it. So the truth, which is very reasonable, which is very rationally based, will be available to one and all, had it not been for preconceived ideas. What does this mean when we talk about back to basics and we say anything that is frowned upon or we need to hide? That is a perfectly reasonable proposition. Nobody will disagree with that. Now you tell me, you and me are born within Islam, yes? We can never be objective to the extent to which we want to be or we need to be objective, yes? We can never be because we're conditioned. Now we need to break through this mold. However, if we were to look at another religion, because we have no affection for that, we have no sympathy with that religion, it becomes very clear. So in Hinduism, for most part of their year, they are involved in their cultures of worship of deities. Yes? We will immediately say that this is a waste of time. This is based on superstition and insecurity. It doesn't make sense. Yes? But when we turn inward and we say, well, we have 2, 3 months, 4, 5 months of a year in which we are just doing things which are cultural, which don't make sense, that will not make sense to us. Are you seeing that? If we were to look at the Hindu caste system, we will say it is very unfair. Nobody has precedence over anybody else. God cannot create one as a superior and another one as inferior. There is a fair playing field here, level playing field with God. Yet, when we come inside Islam and we talk about these different ranks of people that they acquire by birth, it makes perfect sense to us. We are not self-critical about it. If we were to look at a religion that advocates only salvation for its own followers and damnation for everybody else, we will frown upon that religion, won't we? We will say, what a nonsensical religion, what a nonsensical theology that says that this person is good and godly, that person is good and godly, but this person has a label that makes him eligible for favors of God, and that person doesn't have a label, and therefore he will be damned. We will say, this doesn't make sense, and I would never be appealed by such a religion. Yet, within Islam, we say the same thing. It doesn't make sense. But yet, we will not understand it because we don't want to be critical and we can't break away from those molds. Think about things very, very openly. Now, I'm going to pose a question here. Isn't it really odd that we all end up justifying the truth of the religions in which we take birth? A Christian will justify the validity of Christianity, a Jew of Judaism, a Hindu of Hinduism, a Buddhist of Buddhism, and a Muslim of Islam, a Shia of Shiism, a Sunni of Sunnism, yes, a Wahhabi of Wahhabism. Doesn't that ring a bell? What is happening? In fact, none of us have ever been exposed to the truth as the truth is in its own self. We have taken birth in packaged religions and we have gone about it, we have convinced ourselves of it. But none of it actually makes sense if we look at it in its core and in its essence. Now look at it further. How unjust would it be of a God who brings me into a Muslim household and my brother who is better than me in a Christian household, or makes me take birth in a 12-er household and makes my brother take birth in a Sunni household? He justifies Sunnism, I justify Shiaism, yes? And we condemn each other. And if I am the right one, then God is unjust. Can you see that? Then God is the unfair one, because I did not choose the location or my parents, not to the best of my recollection. I didn't choose any of these things. When the Prophet challenged, the challenge was easy for the pagans to understand and digest, but it was very, very difficult for the Jews and the Christians to digest, because they had already preconceived ideas of the same religion, the Abrahamic legacy that carried on within Moses, Jesus, and Rasulullah. This is the same case in which me and you find ourselves. that we are within a packaged religion, and if we look into it, we will find that either it is not based on rational basis, it is not making common sense, it is intuitively incorrect, or that there are a host of things in there that really do not make sense. Now, I know many things that I can discuss now will be very, very sensitive. But think about it this way. What if we were sitting in a lecture theater without this setting of mimbar and muharram, and a person who is standing at neutral ground is delivering a lecture with which we are not emotionally connected? Then life would be much simpler, yes? That we don't presume that that person is the mouthpiece of God, and we don't presume ourselves as being the defenders and upholders of the truth. The only presumption is that we want to understand what is being said and what makes sense. When the Prophet used to speak, people used to shout and say, "He's a madman." One person used to shout, then another, then the third, and the whole mob used to shout. Now the Prophet, the Quran responds. The Quran says, look, whatever he is saying, go away, either alone or in twos or threes. Go and think about what he is saying. He is not a madman. He makes sense. Think about it very carefully. If we can presume that, then I ask you simple questions. Very, very simple questions. Truly, striking the sword on the head and drawing blood in the name of Imam Hussain, yes? When it gives a message which is quite barbaric to an onlooker and frightens the onlooker and chases them away from ever investigating the deen of Imam Hussain, is that reasonable? Does that make sense? If you were to see another religious group who cuts their heads and beats themselves in public, what message would they send to you? Would you be drawn to that religion? Or would you say, my goodness, it's not a sort of religion that I want to associate with, especially if we have grown up in Western cultures? I'm not saying don't do that for Imam Hussain. Imam Hussain deserves more than that. If we could cut our heads off for Hussain ibn Ali, it will be less than what he deserves. But tell me, that act, does it serve any purpose to the onlooker? Does it make sense? Then why are we not critical about it? Why don't we admit that there are certain things that should not be done in public? Or if they are not done in public and we are hiding away from it, then religion should not have anything that it needs to hide. It needs to be very, very open, because it needs to appeal to humanity at large. So then why aren't we becoming very, very critical about it? This is just an example that I'm giving. It's not the central example. We want to deal with things which are far more pressing. But from time to time, we will give such examples just to awaken the audience, because they have a tendency of falling to sleep. Salawat. The more we struggle, the greater is the reward, yes? So the more effort we put in staying awake, the greater is the thawab. Now, one of the things here that we notice is that when the Prophet challenged the people, it presumes something. It presumes that the people already knew the truth prior to him reasserting it. How? When the Prophet said, "Do not cheat," they already knew that cheating was bad. So they said, yes, he makes sense. If they already did not know that cheating was bad, they would not have been able to make that judgment. Can you see that? If a cannibal were to come here and say, eat each other, or if you are upset with somebody, go and eat them, we would say, this is nonsense. It doesn't make sense. Wouldn't we? This doesn't make sense. But if a person were to come and say to a cannibal, look, just because you are not at good terms with this person doesn't mean you go and eat them. There are other ways of resolving this thing. Eat an animal instead. They will not say, no, but everybody should eat their enemies. That's the best way to live. The cannibal would not probably say that. The cannibal would say, yeah, you make sense. But if a cannibal would say to me, well, look, you've just fought with this person, why don't you eat him? I would say, well, that doesn't make sense. We already know the truth within ourselves. So everything that the Prophet said to his community, he knew for a fact that they know what I am talking about and they know the truth in whatever I am saying. What that means is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has first and foremost communicated with all of us at our individual levels. And then He has revealed the Quran. The Quran is termed as the reminder. Reminder of what? Reminder of what we already know. Can you see that? So if the Quran says, look, you can't follow your forefathers if it doesn't make sense, no matter who your forefathers were, then that in itself we will acknowledge it makes sense, doesn't it? If our forefathers were doing something wrong, it doesn't mean we should do it. If the Quran says you should not follow your chiefs and your elders if they don't make sense, then no matter how great the elder or the chief, it doesn't make sense. I often give this example. Zakir Naik was asked, well, why do you send salutations on Yazid and bless Yazid? He said, Imam Ghazali did so, and Imam Ghazali said that Yazid may have been forgiven, and I send blessings of God, well, incur the mercy of God upon him. So what if Ghazali said so? If Ghazali doesn't, Ghazali is a great person, by the way, he's a huge theologian and an Arif. But in this instance, he is saying something that doesn't make sense. So what if he's Ghazali? What if he's the greatest champion and the saint and the scholar of this world? If he doesn't make sense, simply he doesn't make sense. Yes? Because the truth is already within us and we know. All we need to do is arrive at that neutral ground, open up, be receptive to the truth as it is, be challenging and be very, very critical. Now what we will do in the next lectures is, we will look at Islam in its classical categorization. Islam is normally categorized as theology, morality, and ahkam. And we'll explain what theology is, what morality consists of, and what ahkam consists of, and what are these teachings. Then we will look at how the Prophet introduced his Islam. He did it in a very natural way, very gradual way, and he put the responsibility and the ownership of human life upon individuals themselves. These things have gone out of Islam today. So we will talk about that. And then we will talk about the things that are within Islam at present and how to re-look at them. And most prominently, we will look at the theory of form and essence, of going back to the basics, private practice, public practice, the lighter weight and the heavier weight. The heavier weight is the Quran, the lighter weight is the Prophet's family. So we will use these tools to resolve these inconsistencies that are there within the religion, Islam as a whole, at present. Now it will pose a lot of challenge to the mind, but we hope, inshallah, that we can go through it calmly and slowly. Now, as we go into the narrative of the Imam, when Khawli, one of the assassins of the Imam, murderers of the Imam, he went back with the head of Imam Hussain. It was night, so he went home first. No, before going to Karbala, Khawli was approached by his wife. And his wife said to Khawli, what do you intend? He said, well, Hussain is in Karbala. Khawli was in Kufa. He said, I'm going to go and fight against Hussain because he's refusing the allegiance owed to Yazid. So his wife said, but you do know this is Hussain, the grandson of the Prophet. And he is not wrong in his claim. Yazid is not a righteous caliph. And you can't go and fight against Hussain. Khawli narrated a hadith of the Prophet. And the hadith of the Prophet states, and this is a hadith of the Prophet according to our brothers as well. The hadith states that if a person rises against a Khalifa, put them to death no matter who he is. So Khawli said, even if it is Imam Hussain, he is against the Khalifa and we need to put him to death. Now, The Kholi's wife is saying, but this hadith does not make sense. It doesn't make sense. It's a false hadith. The Prophet could never say such a thing. When you know that Hussain ibn Ali is on the right. But Kholi justifies his actions through such a hadith. I remember once we contended against certain ahadith that our brothers have, and the response that they gave was that these compilers of ahadith, they did wudu and they prayed 2 rakat namaz before compiling their books of hadith. I said, even if they did ghusl and prayed 100 rakat namaz, that thing which is nonsensical in itself is nonsensical in itself. No matter how many wudus we do, no matter how many rakats namaz we pray, it doesn't make sense in itself. Can you see that? And if you were to give such a hadith to mankind, they would not make sense of it. They would say, what sort of a ridiculous religion is this? There are further ahadiths that say, do jihad with every ruler. Even if they kill innocent people, they will have the responsibility of killing innocent people. You will have the reward of doing jihad. It's nonsense. It doesn't make sense. This is what we are going towards. Hussain Salamullah alayhi spent the most part of the morning of Ashura trying to clarify the minds of his opponents. He was saying, you know who I am. This is the book of God that he had placed on his head. This is what the Prophet has said about me. I am the only son of the daughter of the Prophet of Islam. This is my claim. You know that is wrong. You know I am right. The only response they came back was, either pay the allegiance to the caliph or we put you to death. That's about it. We don't know anything other than that, and that is our Islam. And the amazing part of it all is, guess what? They buried their dead and they prayed Salatul Janaza, and then they went away. That is their Islam. This same Hussain is summoned by Walid bin Utbah on the 27th of Rajab, at the death of Muawiyah. When Muawiyah died, he secured the Pledge of Allegiance of the most of the prominent people of Arabia, save 3 or 4 people. Among them were Abdullah bin Umar, Abdullah bin Zubair, and Imam Hussain Salamullah alayhi. And Muawiyah wrote to Yazid and he said, as far as Abdullah bin Umar is concerned, treat him well and he will be by your side. As far as Abdullah bin Zubair is concerned, kill him wherever you find him and cut him into pieces, for he will devour you. As far as Hussain is concerned, Salamullah alayhi, do not fight against him. But if he comes in revolt against you, then overpower him. But at the same time, be good to him because of his noble position. Muawiyah was very, very shrewd. Yazid lacked that shrewdness. Yazid dispatched a letter to his governor in Medina, which was Walid. And he said to Walid, extract the Pledge of Allegiance from Hussain, and under no circumstances let him leave without giving the Pledge of Allegiance. When Imam Hussain received the message of Walid, he surmised Walid's intentions, and he gathered his brothers and his sons with him, and he said to them, I fear the worst. Walid has summoned me at this point in night. I will go inside his office. If you were to hear my voice being raised, then come to my aid immediately. We hear from the Dhakirin that Abbas Salamullah alayhi was amongst the most prominent people who was with Imam Hussain, and then Akbar, and then Sajjad, and other brothers of Imam Hussain and the brothers of Hazrat Abbas. When Imam Hussain entered, Marwan was sitting with Walid. Walid passed on the news of the demise of Muawiyah to Imam Hussain. The Imam, as was his custom, he said, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. He said, now after Muawiyah, Yazid is the Khalif of the Muslim Ummah, and he demands your bay'ah, your oath of allegiance. Imam Hussain said to him, Walid, would you not rather you sought my allegiance in front of the masses in the daytime? Walid said, indeed, that would be better. Then why don't you go back to your home and come back to me tomorrow? When Marwan heard this, he said, Walid, if you let him leave from your office at this point, you will never find him again until there is much bloodshed between us and them. So either take the oath of allegiance from him right now or behead him. When he said behead him, Imam Hussain was startled. He moved from his chair and he said, shall you behead me? As Hussain raised his voice, we find the Dhakirin narrating that Abbas Salamullah alayhi unhinged the door with one push of his hand. His sword was drawn and he was in a state of rage and anger. When Walid and Marwan saw this, they jumped from their seats and retreated and against the wall. Imam Hussain placed his hand upon the chest of Abbas and he said, calm your soul, O brother. When he saw their frightened state, Imam Hussain left the office of Walid, and behind him were the Bani Hashim. Abbas ibn Ali, we hear, was sobbing as Hussain walked in front of him. When Hussain came back home, he was met by Zainab. And Zainab said to him, dear brother, what did he want from you? He said to her, O sister, the time that is appointed is dawning closer to us. The promise shall become a truth. She looked at Abbas's state and she said, oh Abbas, what brings you to this state? And Abbas, unable to speak, he said his life was threatened while I stood next to him. We find in narration that Hussain ibn Ali on this night or the night after, he goes to the grave of his grandfather to bid him farewell. When he sits at the grave of the Prophet, he says to the Prophet, O Prophet, indeed the time has come that you had promised me of. And indeed I will march on and do what you expect from me. As he was bidding farewell and as he lamented, he fell unconscious. And in that he saw the Prophet. And the Prophet said to Hussain, look on. This is what I have for you waiting with me. Hussain said, O grandfather, take me to you. The Prophet said, O Hussain, for that you will need to swallow the bitter sips of death and the bitter pains of losing your family, your children. Hussain said, O grandfather, it is all acceptable by me. We find the Dhakirin saying at this point that one of the wives of the Prophet, Salma, came to Imam Hussain and she said, O Hussain, I hear that you have resolved to go towards Iraq. He said, yes. She said, I beseech you for the sake of Allah, do not go. For therein is your death and your destruction. Your grandfather had told me this and warned me about this day, that this is a possibility and it may happen. Imam said, O grandmother, I know well what is to come upon us, and I do it knowingly. She said, O Hussain, how is that possible? The Dhakirin narrate. He said, O grandmother, do you wish to see the fate that awaits me? She said, yes, O child. He said, look at what I show you. Look on, O grandmother, what is it that you see? I see a desert which is empty, but I hear cries of children. He said, O grandmother, look on. As she looked on, she cried uncontrollably. O grandmother, what did you see? I saw what looked like the body of your Akbar, cast upon the plains, with a dagger implanted deep within his chest, and you sitting by his feet, and him rubbing his heels apart to leave this world. He said, "Oh grandmother, look on." As she looked on, she cried and lost her consciousness. And when she awoke, she said, "Oh child, I saw your body without a head, and I saw you beneath the hooves of horses. Oh child, I saw your sister enslaved. I saw your daughter in embrace of your headless body." ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. إلهي إنا نسألك بحق الحسين وجده وأبيه وأمه وأخيه وتسعة المعصومين من ذريته وبنيه. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار. اللهم عجل فرج إمامنا المنتظر واجعلنا من أنصاره وأعوانه والمستشهدين بين يديه. رحم الله من قرأ الفاتحة.